with a diagnosis or without a diagnosis, it all depends on relationships and the quality of the relationships that can be established. And so, and somehow the psychotherapy, that for me, it relieved, relieved me of a lot of the guilt, and it kind of released me to be able to support Annie and just discover with her. I kept a really, I kept a journal during this time, so I was kind of writing a lot as well about it, and which also enabled me to detach myself a bit from it, so I wasn't this horrible feeling of being out of my depth and literally drowning in whatever it was that I didn't understand.
Voices Unmuted, un podcast sans filtre par Jendelings Maurice.
Hello, Sue Bard. So
Hi.
lovely to have you here with us. Sue, can you tell us a little bit about autism? You are a mother of a 42 years old girl, Annie.
Woman.
Woman, yes, woman. And can you tell us a little bit about how did you learn about Annie's autism? When was it diagnosed? What are the help you got? And maybe at that time, the difficulty behind it?
Yeah. Well, Annie was my fourth child, so I had experience of having children and looking after babies. When Annie was born, it was really obvious to me really quickly that she wasn't like my other children, and she also wasn't like any other children I'd ever come across, really. And I found it really, really difficult to look after her because she didn't sleep, she didn't eat, and she cried. She was in distress almost all the time. It just felt really, really painful. And because it felt unique, as in I hadn't experienced it before, I felt it was my fault and that I was doing everything wrong. And because it was unique, it must be my fault. So other people recognized that she wasn't really okay. But at that time, and she was like really from the age of about 5 months, well, she was hospitalized because she was failing to thrive. And at the hospital, they told me to stop breastfeeding her or stop trying to breastfeed her and to give her a bottle, which I actually refused to do. But I did try giving her a bottle as well as carrying on unsuccessfully breastfeeding her. But she was I could see it was no different on the bottle. So I just said I wasn't going to do that because that wasn't, and it felt like there was the potential for some contact and relationship with breastfeeding that there wasn't so much with the bottle, and I really didn't want to stop at least trying to do it. So we kind of staggered on, and from then Annie was she was referred to a pediatrician, a neuropediatrician who used to see us quite regularly, but he never actually said what he thought or whether he knew or what he thought the problem was. He was a really nice man and very sympathetic, but he didn't really throw any light on the situation. And when she was at nursery, again, like she was kept back a year from going into school. She wasn't non-verbal, but she wasn't verbal in any kind of sort of normal, quote unquote, communicative sense. And at that point, she was also referred to a psychologist at the, it was called the Child Guidance Centre in those days, I don't know, it doesn't even exist as a thing now. And at the time, I think people were quite obsessed with not labeling children. They were really reluctant to label children. And I think like that was good in some ways, but it wasn't actually helpful either. And she was referred to as somebody with a child with non-specific learning difficulties. So that label actually told you nothing. And again, somebody used to come around every week and play with her and so on. And I used to she came for an hour every week. So I just used to, when she came, I used to go and lie down and go to sleep for an hour. And again, she was nice and she was sympathetic, but nobody knew anything. And all the time, I think my kind of guilt and responsibility increased, and then that became a factor that was actually paralyzing me in being able to look after her well, because I thought that I was probably the root of the problem, and therefore I couldn't be of benefit to her. Then during this time, there were a few things that happened that were good. At the time, I was working for the local authority, and I was actually responsible for play services for children and young people outside of school. So it was creches, out-of-school care programs, holiday programs. So in that position, I also had friends that, particularly speech therapist friends and just general friends who had children the same age. And at the same time that I was responsible for these services, we also set up a voluntary organisation called Play Plus, because in order to make our play services really inclusive. And so that actually opened an avenue for Annie personally, though I wasn't really consciously thinking of Annie at that point. It was just a principle, really. And so we did have what we had for quite a long time in this local authority. They were really, everything we did was inclusive, completely inclusive of any form of disability. And we worked out various ways of working together. So there was this voluntary organisation and the local authority working together on inclusive play. So that was a big thing. And it also really helped me, it was really good to have contact with a lot of children with different disabilities, but also working inclusively. And I could actually see that Annie enjoyed it as well. Annie has always actually been quite social in a way. So at the same time, I was reading a lot about stuff, and I came across autism. And I can't even remember which book it was that I read, but there was a very kind of restricted, the opposite of now. There was a very restricted definition of autism then. There were two types of autism, apparently. There was classical autism, and that was Leo Kanner, I think. And he had identified children that were mute, that didn't socialize at all, that didn't make eye contact, and that were in a world of their own, which autism virtually means, and that it was very rare, and it was almost unheard of for girls to be autistic. It was just boys, and it was regarded as so rare and weird, and also among these children, there were savants, they were called, who had these special, amazing abilities that nobody could understand how they got them. They could paint and draw, or they could maybe do these incredible architectural drawings, supposedly from memory, or they could play musical instruments and nobody understood how they learned or how they did it or what it meant. So there was an aura of kind of mystery and sort of strangeness about the term autism. But then there was that Canna definition of classical autism, which was rare. Nobody ever came across it because it was so rare, and only boys and all the rest of it. So it couldn't possibly apply to Annie because she wasn't a boy. And then there was this other kind, Asperger's syndrome. It was called it. Asperger's seems to have been, it isn't really used anymore as a category, and then it was also called, that was called high functioning autism. So so there were these children who were intellectually very, very able, but they were still autistic. So it was social interaction was really difficult for them, and so on and so forth. So that, and now that category you don't even hear Asperger's syndrome spoken about anymore. But also when I was reading, I also came across other descriptions that did fit what Annie was like. I mean, she didn't fit this kind of mute, silent. She wasn't silent at all, and she was. But she fitted other things, and I went and heard a lecture from somebody called Rita Jordan, who was speaking in Edinburgh, who was a psychologist in Birmingham, doing really groundbreaking work with autistic children and their parents. And after I heard her, I just wrote to her and sort of learned a lot more about this different approach to autism, which I thought Annie did. I thought it did fit Annie, and I thought and Rita Jordan held out a lot of hope, because they were really sort of starting from the basis. Instead of starting from some theoretical thing, they were starting from the children themselves and what kind of support could help them. And that really helped me to know that this was happening. And Rita Jordan and I corresponded for quite a long time. She was really, really helpful. She wrote me really long letters, and I told her about Annie. And then at that point, it was also, there was a diagnostic centre for. I live in Scotland, as you know. There was a diagnostic centre for autism was set up in Croydon, south of London, where you could go with your child, and for over 3 days they would observe, and they would do all kinds of things and talk to you, talk to them, and then come up with a diagnosis. Now, autism has always been, it's a descriptive diagnosis. It's just, in a way, it's got a very subjective. It's not really. It's a narrative that you give, and on that narrative you get a diagnosis, and that is still the same. You can't scan somebody's brain and say they are autistic. So, like, it's really interesting to me that now that I think the term, I'm sure it's really helpful for people to have a good diagnosis and to get, and then you can start to think about, well, what support works and what other people are doing practically on the ground, because there was work going on the ground. And we got a diagnosis for Annie, and although we lived in Scotland, our local authority paid for Annie because it couldn't be diagnosed in Scotland. I kind of persuaded them that this would be it would be a good idea for Annie to be diagnosed for 3 days in London. So they did. My local authority was good like that, in that it was a small local authority, and if they were used to not being able to provide everything themselves, so they were used to funding people to get help elsewhere if they couldn't give it. So they paid for this diagnosis. It was Lorna Wing, who was very groundbreaking for autism and had an autistic daughter herself. She was a psychologist, and she had set up this place in Croydon. So we went there for 3 days. And at the end of that time, they said that she was severely autistic and with associated learning difficulties, and they couldn't even measure her IQ because either there was no IQ to measure, they didn't really say that, but the way in which you measure IQ was not the way in which you could assess Annie, because she couldn't do those kind of things, or she wouldn't do those kind of things. But it was also a very positive experience. And also by this time, she was in a special unit at primary school, and it was called the Speech and Language Unit. And looking back, I think almost everybody in it was actually autistic. Okay. But it wasn't a diagnosis at the time. And so people, and it really wasn't very good. She wasn't happy there. They didn't really know what they were doing. And they thought that the children would they thought that Annie was deliberately refusing to cooperate or refusing to communicate. And so although they had a very good speech therapist working with them, that was good. Mm-hmm. And Annie did learn to read and write there as well. So Annie has actually almost taught herself to read and write. Wow. By obsessively tracing. She got very attached to certain children's books, and she traced the pictures and the words on each page over and over again. Wow. And coupled with the teaching at the primary school, at the teaching she was actually getting, she learned and taught herself to read and write. And I've still got these tracings that she did. And but at the same time, the neighbouring local authority to us in Scotland, it was a fantastic local authority. It was Strathclyde. It included Glasgow, and they were doing really good work. And I discovered when Annie was in her last year at primary school that they had set up a unit in a primary school in Cumbernauld in this local authority called St Lucy's. It was in the Roman Catholic school, and they were doing brilliant work with kids. I went to see it. It was too late to transfer her because she was already, but the parents there were really campaigning for equivalent secondary provision, because they didn't want their children going into they couldn't go into mainstream, and the existing facilities for children who couldn't go into mainstream weren't suitable for them. And so anyway, Stirling, my local authority, agreed to pay for Annie to go to the next local authority, and she started secondary school. Fantastic. Wow. This unit in Cumbernauld, it was in Cumbernauld near Glasgow, and it was a high school and it had this first, Annie and one other boy were the first two pupils there. And when they moved in, it was still a building site. There were still people building this unit.
How old was she then?
She was, because she was a year behind, and they start secondary school a year later in Scotland. They normally start at 12 plus. She was 13 plus. And the other child was called Ross. And they wouldn't speak to each other. And they were both freaked out by the hammering and the banging and the building. And they had this fantastic staff, really amazing. And we're still in touch with one of the members of staff from there. So eventually the unit had a limit of 10 people, and he was the only girl. So still it was all boys being diagnosed, nearly all boys. And then they were very happy. They found another girl, Sarah. And so Sarah joined. Sarah and Annie hated each other. But she was very at home with this group of boys. It was surreal. There was a fantastic sort of zany sense of humor. It was a bit like being in a Monty Python show when you went there, and like the humor was really, really important. Really, and they did actually gel as a group. So although there was a massive range, there were kids from there who actually went on to university, and each one was an incredible character, and their characters emerged in this setting, and they had really good teaching, very sensitive teaching. And when I speak to the teacher, we're still in touch with, she's at Nadine, who we still see. He said, looking back, she thinks they didn't have a clue what they were doing, and they were just all in there with these crazy kids and these crazy teachers, and it was just, it had elements of almost like a party, but there was really serious work being done. They were supposed to be integrating with the mainstream as well. Each child was supposed to be integrating as much as they could, but that didn't work so well. And actually, the kids in the mainstream school were really attracted to the unit. And a lot of children from mainstream who really were struggling socially or for whatever reason used to come to the unit during the break times and like being there because the whole atmosphere was very different from the mainstream school. So she had a wonderful experience there for her whole secondary education. Wow. But also, when Annie was 7 and before she was diagnosed, a huge help. We got private psychotherapy. It was with a trainee psychotherapist actually, who took a kind of object relations approach to psychotherapy. Very keen on Melanie Klein and people like that, but she worked really unconventionally, and they just said, well, we'll assess Annie and see if she can do this, because it's a one-to-one thing. So Annie, for whatever reason, she stepped into that room and she seemed to know how to enter into that therapeutic relationship, and it just took off immediately. And it was this person has become a friend now. And she also saw Bill and myself and his dad, and she also saw me by myself once a fortnight, which was unconventional. You're not really supposed to do that. But she worked in this unconventional way with Annie. And it was really based on kind of play therapy. But what Annie was like revealing in this was really important and really good and very strong. And then, she was drawing and painting a lot, as you know, Annie's now an artist.
Yes.
And yes.
So you could talk to us about that as well.
And that relationship with her psychotherapist went on for 7 years. That was twice a week. We used to go from Stirling to Edinburgh. We lived in Stirling at the time. Yeah. But it was so worth it. It was so good. It saved our lives. And that happened when she wasn't having a good experience at school, but it was something. And she was, and she did not have a diagnosis at that point, and nobody was thinking about diagnoses really. And although I think that caused problems, it also had its strength, because it meant that people were relating. It all depended on relationships, and I think it still all depends on relationships. With a diagnosis or without a diagnosis, it all depends on relationships and the quality of the relationships that can be established. And so, and somehow the psychotherapy, that for me, it relieved me of a lot of the guilt, and it kind of released me to be able to support Annie. And just discover with her. I kept a journal during this time, so I was kind of writing a lot as well about it, and which also enabled me to detach myself a bit from it. So I wasn't this horrible feeling of being out of my depth and literally drowning in whatever it was that I didn't understand. And again by the secondary school, and she had the diagnosis. So the diagnosis took away the guilt, because that diagnosis is not, you see, people who talked about autism before this approach was developed, they did think it was psychogenic. They did think that it was caused by, they called it frigid air mothers.
Oh, that's harsh.
So yes, it's very and actually one of its proponents was Bruno Bettelheim, who he established this place in Chicago, the Orthogenic Center, where he took children away from their parents because of their mothers. The fathers seemed not to matter at all. They needed to be removed from their mothers. these mothers were doing them harm, and then he was replacing their experiences. Now, Bruno Bettelheim he'd been in a concentration camp, and he had this theory that some people in concentration, he was in Buchenwald, he thought that some people, the people who gave up, there were people in concentration camps who just gave up, and therefore they died. You know, they didn't die because they were being starved and because they died because they gave up. And he called them Muslim. And then he developed this theory of autism, and he said these children were like people who'd been in concentration camps. Well, can you imagine how that made me feel?
What a horror story.
A Jewish Frigidaire mother who's had a child who was like that was similar to how people, you know, this was his whole theory. And he's been discredited now, but in the meantime, you know, his theories had a lot of credence, and because people really didn't understand autism, it was very, very open, and it still is to a certain extent, for people to project weird fantasies and theories of what might help, and to actually to abuse the children. I think you could call it abuse of the children, because they were subjected to very, very strict regimes. There was this kind of time when it was thought good that they stayed in one room and didn't go out at all from one room in their house. And then people had a rota where they spent, like, people on a rota that they were with them in this room for 2 hours at a time, and then they switched for somebody else. And people had got their friends and neighbors, people joined kind of rotas in their communities. It was insane. And of course the child couldn't express, and I don't know, so it's, and then there was a thing called horse riding therapy, where there was this place again in North America that was a riding school, and you had to send your child to live in this kind of place with stables and spend hours each day riding horses.
Really?
Yeah.
Never heard of that.
No.
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
This is terrible.
I can actually find you the references for all these things that I've been referring to. I can't say them off the top of my head, but I have got them written down somewhere. So, yeah, so...
So tell me, how is Annie today?
Annie today is fantastic, actually. She's really great. She lives in the Camp Hill community, which is an international, it's an international movement which started in Vienna in the 1930s. And it was it's really derived from Rudolf Steiner's work, who was Austrian. He was an Austrian philosopher, really, and he developed a philosophy of anthroposophy. Right, leave it. Okay, I'll get it. Yeah, and derived from that was this group. He had a group of young people, including pediatricians. Rudolf Steiner worked directly with children. His theories he worked with children with disabilities, and his work, not as a doctor, not as a psychologist, as a person, just worked with children. And his theories actually derived from his work, from his practical work. And there was a group of people working with him. Some of them were pediatricians. Most of them were actually Jewish, and they had to leave Austria in the night. And they came in 1940. They had contacts with people in London and people in Scotland, and they came. And somebody in Scotland, it was actually a big publishing publishing family, offered them a house called Camp Hill House to establish a community in Scotland. And anthroposophy, thank you, anthroposophy. So these people established this community in Camp Hill House in Aberdeenshire, near Aberdeen, and therefore it was called Camp Hill Community, and from that it developed into an international movement where they developed theories of working with children with learning difficulties, learning disabilities and physical disabilities. And eventually other people went off to other places and established it. It does exist in many countries. The Scottish branch seems to be particularly successful, and we're one of the few that's sort of still working on the original methods of life sharing, that people live together as a community and they share lives, and that there's this dynamic between them, that that everybody is giving to it and everybody is gaining from it, and that is still how Annie's community in Edinburgh. It's a very small Camp Hill community. It has a maximum of 12 people living residentially in 3 different households, and never more than 4 people in one household. And then living with Annie and 3 other people are a Hungarian family, lovely, you know, the father, Mike, is American Hungarian, has more or less been brought up all his life with this ethos. And his wife, Andrea, is also Hungarian, whose family thought that she'd run away with a cult when she first got to know Mike. But they're all but anyway, they've all, you know, they've had a lot of experience of working in this way, and they've got 2 children of their own, and they live in this community. And for each year, volunteers come, usually from Germany, where there's a strong kind of training thing, and spend a year with this community. And there's also a day service attached to it, which has workshops and things. And a sister organisation in Edinburgh, also Rudolf Steiner derived, that has workshops where Annie goes part of the time for her during the day, and where she so 3 days a week she's in a kind of in studios that are quite explicitly kind of artistic. There's a pottery art studio, and then there's kind of an art and craft studio. Then she works 1 day a week in a bakery, and 1 day a week outdoors in the gardens. Tiferet is the name of the organisation. Tiferet is a Hebrew word, actually, and it means beauty and harmony. And it's actually a word that the Kabbalists have adopted, and for them it means uniting of the earthly and the heavenly spheres. And the reason it has this name is the original founders of Tiferet, who were Christian Kabbalists. Well, they weren't Christian Kabbalists, but they certainly weren't Jewish. And actually the original Jewish people that set up Camp Hill, the anthroposophists are actually Christian, but very, very ecumenical, very open. They don't have a creed, they don't have priests, they don't, you know, they're very, very open, and really they accepting of it. It's a very interesting movement, actually. So, and they were wondering, when they founded Tiferet community, it was just them and their children, and 2 children that they were fostering or had adopted, I think, by that time, who had learning difficulties. So they established that community, and it grew from that. And they were wondering what to call this community. And he was reading the Kabbalah one evening by the fire, and he thought Tiferet, this Hebrew word, would be a good name for it. So my mother loved the fact that it had a Hebrew name. And people nowadays mostly don't even know what it means. And every so often somebody says, we have to change this name. Nobody can remember it. Nobody knows what it means. And every time somebody says that, I say, well, I will lie down in the road and you can run me over before you change that name. Because it's a beautiful name.
Yeah, it's got all this meaning.
Yeah, it's got all this
now
meaning.
Annie is a fully
So Annie is a member of this community, but the community supports me as well. I'm very involved with it and with the household, and it's really, it works in a really beautiful way, and is also very normal. It's very ordinary. It's like, it's not weird in any way, and the people in it all, there's an enormous amount of respect and high expectations of what people can do, even people with quite really severe, you know, with really difficult challenges, and whatever anybody brings is valued, and it's very, it operates like a very normal household. Things go wrong, things don't always work out, people forget stuff, but they're very open about, you know, it's nothing is hidden. Yeah.
This is beautiful, because I mean, we'd love to see things like that happening in Mauritius as well, because
well, it's not very general in the UK. It's quite rare.
It's quite rare.
Yeah.
But if we can
but
take
it does exist.
Yeah,
it does exist.
That's right. And if we can use examples like that to bring it to Mauritius, that could be something interesting.
There were, I don't know if there still are, Camp Hill communities in South Africa, but there was one in Botswana. At least one in Botswana. I don't know what the situation is now, and maybe other African countries. I'm not sure. They were in America. They were in Ireland, but it's difficult. It's difficult to sustain them, in that sometimes they run against what is fashionable in social theory and social policy at any one time, because there's been such an anti-institutional movement, which like is good in some ways, but really these communities are not institutional, but the people who run local authorities, and it is mostly local authorities, not central authority, that run things, they're so blind to, they will not. They talk about people living independently and how important it is for people to live independently. But for many people, it's not possible for them literally. None of us can actually live independently of anybody else. And some people need support to live independently. So, like, you get situations where adults with learning disabilities are in a small flat by themselves with somebody coming in maybe twice or 3 times a day, and that's regarded as independent living. And where Annie lives is regarded as not independent living because they're living as a group. But it's much healthier. And of course there are some people who literally cannot live as part of a group as well, but actually a lot of people can, and Annie certainly can. She certainly can live as one of a group. And they look after each other as well in a really lovely way. And it's, we're really lucky. We're really, really lucky. I mean, Annie, she is an artist. Her work sells, it's exhibited, and there's actually a new exhibition starting on May the 30th. And it's going on till I think 22nd of June or something in Edinburgh, with four pieces of hers in it. It's all portrait. The theme of the exhibition is portraiture.
Wow.
And Annie actually has been doing quite a lot of portraits, but she does other things as well. But the way in which the people in, like, the art studio is very, very small. People go to it for 1 day a week, and they select who goes, because by noticing how they're operating in other parts of their and it never has more than 3 people at a time in it. There are 2 women artists who are artists in their own right as well, but also run this studio, and they job share running it.
Beautiful.
And they do, and the way they work with them is really interesting. And there's there's some really nice video documenting how people work together, and I'm sure I can put.
Please.
Yeah.
We can always put the link.
Yeah.
Podcast.
Yes.
I think that would be interesting as well.
Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Sue. Thank you for your time. Thank you for telling us how things are in Scotland and the all the help and also kind of a history
Yeah.
of how things been going. And now, I mean, you're just so happy to hear how Annie's doing well. And
I would
we
never
are
have,
just so-
you know, when I look back to her early childhood, I couldn't even bear to think into the future.
Wow.
And I would never have dreamed that this would be possible for her, or this is what could happen.
So there is hope, even for Mauritius. There is hope
Oh,
for
definitely.
our
Yeah.
children, because right now I'm not too sure what is happening, but there are things that can be done
Yeah.
with the right support, the right entourage.
But you know, the work that you're doing, you yourself are doing, is also, it's about relationships, as we know, isn't it? It's all about relationships.
It is.
And so that means growth on both sides. A relationship isn't something for one person by definition. It's
That's right.
for at least two.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Voices Unmuted, een podcast sans filtre by Gendelings Maurice.